Oggi Temenos è a Zurigo. Siamo in compagnia di Murray Stein, un noto psicoanalista junghiano di fama internazionale. Infatti Murray Stein, diplomato al Carl Gustav Jung Institute proprio qui a Zurigo, è tra i fondatori dell'Associazione in Psicologia Analitica di Chicago. È stato presidente per l'associazione IAAP, che è l'Associazione Internazionale di Psicologia Analitica, ed è stato presidente anche dell'Istituto ISAP di Zurigo, scuola di psicoterapia, anche questa scuola di grande importanza. È autore di molti libri. Numerosi sono stati anche tradotti in lingua italiana ed editi soprattutto dalla Moretti Vitali e dalla MAGI edizioni. Temenos innanzitutto vuole ringraziare Murray Stein per la sua disponibilità a questa intervista, questa video intervista su un tema a noi molto caro, che è quello sull'attualità del pensiero di Carl Gustav Jung. In particolare a Murray Stein chiederemo l'attualità del Libro Rosso, in particolare, un tema che lo ha visto e lo vede tuttora molto impegnato. Il Libro Rosso entra, diciamo, nel settore tardivamente, perché viene pubblicato solo nel 2009, in Italia nel 2010, praticamente un secolo dopo la sua creazione. Nonostante questo, il Libro Rosso rappresenta un libro fondamentale di questo settore. Murray Stein si è già occupato nel passato del Libro Rosso, se ne sta occupando con tanti altri colleghi, mi diceva prima con 50 addirittura analisti junghiani, e tutto questo per verificare e valutare come il Libro Rosso influenzerà la psicologia analitica e come diciamo possa essere utilizzato dai lettori contemporanei. Vorrei iniziare questa intervista comunque con un paio di domande di carattere generale e dopo passiamo al Libro Rosso. Naturalmente le domande le porrò in lingua inglese. Prima domanda. Vorrei, given the present cultural and political climate in the world today, what's your view about the relevance of Jungian psychoanalysis? I mean, does long-term treatment of individuals still make sense, or it has only a luxury for rich people?
It makes as much sense today as it ever did. When Jung began as a psychoanalyst working with Freud at first, he was a psychiatrist in a clinic, worked in the Berkeley clinic in Zurich for about 10 years, and so he was treating patients in a normal psychiatric way. And then he opened a private practice in his home, and in the course of time he found that his patients changed. No longer was his practice a psychiatric one as it had been in the clinic, but now it was more a general psychotherapeutic practice. And so people would come to him for treatment who did not have severe psychiatric symptoms. They did not have to be hospitalized. Of course, in those days there was no medication to give them. And so this talking cure, which Freud had discovered and invented in Vienna in the 19th century, Jung continued to use with these patients who came with problems like loss of meaning, what we today might call burnout, or second half of life problems. He worked a lot with adult patients And patients who you could say were not so mentally ill that they could not function. They were high-functioning people, most of them. And slowly his reputation became a very international one, and people from all over the world came. And he trained a certain number of people in his group around him here in Zurich to treat them in what we now know as Jungian psychoanalysis, with strong emphasis on working with dreams, interpreting dreams, and also with active imagination, with transference, projection, working on the shadow, the anima, and so on. And so what this became really was a project to develop the personality rather than to cure symptoms. In the course of developing a personality, the symptoms also take a different place in a person's life. Jung said that the most important questions, the most important psychological questions that come to a psychotherapist cannot really be solved. They are problems that one has to live with or live into, and in the course of time they come to occupy a different position in a person's life. And in some cases, they have a great meaning because they drive people in a search for understanding and depth that they otherwise would not have. So he would sometimes say, thank God for your neurosis. That brings you to the point where you have to individuate, where you have to develop yourself. And so Jungian psychoanalysis became a kind of combination between psychotherapy, working with people's problems and symptoms, and a psychological spiritual development that he called individuation. Now that will continue to be relevant as long as there are human beings on the planet, because we are all born with a potential to develop. Many people reach a certain stage of this development and stop, and others want to go on further. And for those who want to go on further and develop their self-understanding, their spiritual life, their connection with the unconscious, with their creativity, with imagination, and so on, will always be looking for something like Jungian psychoanalysis. Now, is it for rich people? Well, it is costly. The people who came to Jung, because he was so famous, were often very rich people, Rockefellers, Mellons, people like that. And they helped him to establish his school in various ways. Edith McCormick Rockefeller bought the building that housed the Psychological Club and the first Jung Institute. Mary Mellon set up the Bollingen Foundation, which published Jung's books in English and translated everything. So these wealthy people were very instrumental and helpful in gaining a foothold in the world for Jung. Jung himself couldn't have done that without their assistance. And then what happened is that as Jungian psychology spread throughout the world, and really today is a globalized movement, many of the people who practice Jungian psychoanalysis come from rather modest backgrounds. They aren't rich people. And the people who come to train, for instance, in Zurich and ISAP, it is expensive to come here to live in Switzerland for 4 or 5 years to do the training. But they find a way, and some of them have very little means, and they do it not in order to get rich or to work with wealthy people. They do it out of a sense of calling. It's a vocation. And when you ask them, why are you doing this? You aren't going to get rich from it. You aren't going to make a lot of money. You have to work with very ordinary people who can't pay high fees. They say, I do this because I must do it. I don't have a choice. This is for me. This is the most important thing in my life. So I do it for myself, for my meaning in life. And I want to share this with other people. And they go into other parts of the world and they charge normal psychotherapy fees. Sometimes it's covered by insurance, sometimes not. The people I've worked with over the years, most of them are not wealthy people. They're average, they're working people. Some of them are working class people, some of them are professionals. There have been a few wealthy people, but most Jungian practices are not filled with wealthy people. So I think it's Jungian psychoanalysis is not for everybody, uh, because everybody isn't looking for what it has to offer. Some people just want a quick cure. They're glad to take a pill, or they're glad to have a few sessions of psychotherapy, cognitive therapy, or something to help them recover from a trauma, and then they get back into their life, and that's fine for them. But for those individuals who are looking for something more, for development, what we call individuation experiences, Jungian psychoanalysis is available, it's offered. There are training programs going on throughout the world. People aren't getting rich from being Jungian analysts. And they're treating people in many different walks of life, in clinics, people just off the street, schools, students, artists. So no, it's not for rich people at all. It's for people who are looking for meaning and depth.
Thank you. We are living in a very chaotic world. So, Murray, does Jung theory help us to understand the chaos of the world today? And if so, how? I mean, is this understanding useful for people in position of authority? If you were a counselor for example, to one of them, what would you say?
The world is in a very turbulent phase right now. It's hard to tell, is it more turbulent than it was in the 20th century when we had all these world wars and colonialism was coming to an end and new countries were being formed? And I mean, you could say since the Middle Ages, the world has been in turbulence. Since the Reformation, since the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution, we've had turbulence in the world. Probably turbulence at the end of the Roman Empire. There's always been turbulence. So I don't know if it's really more severe now than it has been, but it is severe and people experience it as severe. And there's a lot of fear. There's a fear of violence. There's a fear of these fundamentalist fanatics who carry out their destructive activities now in many different parts of the world. And Jung had a theory about where we are culturally. And I think that theory can help us. It's based on the notion that human society is going through a phase of transformation at the end of the age of Pisces, going into the age of Aquarius. And Jung used this framework from astrology and the Platonic years that occur every 2,000 years and change. There's a kind of period of transition between one age and another age. And astrologically, we are moving out of the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. And in these transition times, there is a lot of confusion. Old things are dying, old ways, old habits, old cultural forms, and people are very uneasy about what's happening. They don't know what's coming. The new hasn't formed yet. So we're in a kind of in-between time. We call it liminality, cultural liminality. And this may last for a century or longer until a new cultural consensus worldwide. Now we're on a stage of a new kind of globalization that has never existed before in the history of the world. There has been globalization in the sense of trade routes and colonies, and the British Empire was huge in the 19th century, so there was a kind of globalization process. But now with these communications that we've got today, the world has shrunk and people can communicate with each other. We know instantly what's happening in other parts of the world. People are learning common languages, translations are taking place regularly. So we're entering into a phase where a kind of global culture will form that I think has to take into account differences as well as commonalities. And what people are feeling in many parts of the world is a threat to their local culture, because globalization is wiping away a lot of their particularities and their habits, their habitual forms of life, and their beliefs, and so how to get a balance between a global system, financial system, let's say, even a political system, the UN, and things like that, where you have an overarching agreement about what life should be like, human rights, so on and so forth, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have local color and flavor, you have language, you have history, you have art forms that are highly prized and strongly held onto. And so getting this balance between the particular and the local and the global in general is a process that I think we're going through. We don't have it right yet. I think we're realizing that globalization happened very fast, maybe too fast. Now we have to go back to recognizing the rights of local societies to live in a particular way. And so this idea of multiculturalism and allowing for differences, accepting differences is very difficult for us, because sometimes the differences really offend us and grate us, and we don't like it. And yet, if you force your globalized ways on other people, they will rebel, they will fight back, and that's what we're seeing now. So what would I say to a politician of significance? I would say something like that. You have to recognize local situations, with the people, who the people are and what they want, and you have to have a bigger picture too. I think with Obama, for instance, you had the big picture, but not enough of the acceptance of the local differences. Now with Trump in the United States, everything is America first, and the global picture is eliminated. It's like an enantiodromia, into the opposite. But that will come back because globalization is here to stay. It can't be stopped. In addition to that, Jung believed, and I think I accept that and I subscribe to it, that humanity is moving toward greater consciousness, but slowly, and it goes back and forth. But if you look back at history, where we are now, today, in our level of consciousness, at its best at least, I think it's a significant degree greater and broader and deeper than it was before the 20th century. For instance, psychoanalysis, Jungian analysis, I think extended the range tremendously of consciousness and deepened it. And that's what the mission of analytical psychology is in the world, to continue that movement toward consciousness, to teach it, to help people understand themselves better, to find their meaning in life, and to understand that humanity is in this together. So we have to work together, and we have to respect differences.
Very interesting, Murray, thank you. I would like now to make some question about the Red Book, the actualization of the Red Book. The Red Book was published in 2009, nearly a century after its creation. Is it only an historic curiosity, or was the publication meaningful for the postmodern human being struggling to find meaning today? Is the Red Book, meaningful for our time?
The short answer is yes, but it's not easy to find that meaning. When Jung separated from Freud, as he writes about in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he was in a period of transition, like I've just spoken about. He was leaving something structured that he had worked very hard for in his career, and he was making a transition to becoming a Jungian. And there was a period of time that he didn't really know what he was doing quite. He knew he had to leave, psychoanalysis, Freudian ideas behind, and look for something that would be more suitable for his understanding and his way of working with people. And in that period of time, he decided to make an experiment with himself. Now, I say decided, he would say he was forced to. It wasn't really a free decision, in the sense that he was very heavily pressed from the inner side to deal with himself. He was having some, what he called visions. He was having very strong emotional reactions to various people and to his situation. And so he decided to make this experiment and go with what was coming up in him. And that was a great risk on his part, because he didn't know where it would lead. And sometimes he thought he might be becoming like his patients at the psychiatric clinic at tuberculously, going mad, becoming schizophrenic. He was a little afraid that his family was tainted, and there were some problems in some of the previous generations, mental health problems. So, he was not comfortable, but he decided to pursue this anyway. And out of that experience, over a period of about 2 years, from fall of 1913 to 1916, basically, he had these inner experiences, called them active imaginations, dialogues, with figures that came to him, and they gave themselves names, and he had conversations. It was a kind of contained madness, you could say. But it was contained, and it was well contained enough so that he could write down these conversations, and gradually he started working on them to understand them. And he created a text, first writing down the experiences in the black books, as he called it, just what happened. And then later he made some reflections on that, some trying to understand what did this mean for him, for his life. And so he created a text out of this. And then he started copying this story that he had developed, and the commentaries. And it's a complex text. It's a multi-layered text that he started writing in calligraphic script into this book that he bought here in Zurich, called the Red Book. We call it the Red Book now. And he named it Libro Novus, the new book. To my ear, that has a resonance, because Jung was also raised in the Protestant church. His father was a father, a Protestant, Swiss Protestant minister, his grandfather was, and he grew up in the Bible. Now, in the Bible, you have, for Protestants, for Christians, you have two testaments. You have the Old Testament and you have the New Testament, the Old Book and the New Book. Now, he calls this the New Book, the Liber Novus. So it's like the New Testament. So this is a testament for him, for himself. In a sense, he's elaborating his own myth. He says he went in search of a myth, and now he's creating a book that contains his personal myth. And that's like his own personal religion, in a sense. It's his spirituality. And these dialogues you can see that he has with figures like Elijah, Philemon, Saul, Isdubar, and so on. These are of a highly sophisticated spiritual nature. This is not at all what Freud was talking about as the unconscious. When Freud talked about the unconscious, you had shadow material. There's very little real shadow material in the Red Book. It's of a highly sophisticated spiritual nature. So Jung was developing something that was quite different from psychoanalysis, and searching for meaning. And he felt, in the end, that meaning can come out of an inner discovery process. If you go inward and you use active imagination, you can develop a personal mythology, so to speak, out of your active imaginations. And this would serve Jung then for the rest of his life as a kind of general orientation. The question has come up, why did Jung then continue to write psychology? Why wasn't this enough for him? Well, he felt that his mission was much larger than just serving himself. He had his own mythology, could have lived with that. He had enough money, he could have retired, lived on the lake, and done his own thing. But he felt an obligation to the collective, as he said. And in one essay he writes, it's about 1918 or so, he writes that if you take something away from the general collectivity, from society, by withdrawing from it, you are obligated to pay back to society what you have taken away. And so then he had a further extension of his mission was to translate what he had discovered and what he was thinking into a language that the general population could read and understand, and that became his psychology, his psychological works. A great revelation to people to be able to actually see what was in there. We all knew it existed, but nobody knew exactly what was in it. We had pieces of it. Jung wrote about it in Memories, Dreams, Reflections in chapter 6, where he talks about confrontation with the unconscious. There's a lot of material. And he gave a seminar in 1925 at the Psychological Club that's now published, where he talks about some of the details of in the Red Book. But there were a lot of rumors circulating about what was hidden in the Red Book, and that it would be very embarrassing to Jungians if it were ever published, so it was hidden away in a bank vault for many years, and Jung in his lifetime didn't want to make it public. He was afraid it would damage his reputation, and other people suggested that he shouldn't publish it. Some thought maybe he should. But in the end, it was published, and in a very nice edition, beautiful edition, with facsimile pages of the whole Red Book as Jung created it, and then translated into English and Italian and Japanese and Chinese, many languages now. So now we know what's there. And the question then came up, well, if you read in it, it's interesting historically. It tells you a lot about what happened to Jung in 1913. In 1913 and 1928, he worked on this. Beautiful pictures he painted in there. He never completed it. It ends in mid-sentence. It just stops. He took an interest in alchemy, and he left the Red Book, put it aside. And when Sonu Shamdasani was given the job of editing it, he finished it in a sense. So we have the part of the text that Jung did not put into the Red Book, we have in the translation and in the Red Book as it was published in 2009. So the entire text we have now, and it's in 3 parts: Liber Novus, Liber Secundus, and what's called Prüfungen, or scrutinies, as it's translated into English. 3 parts. The scrutinies part, the 3rd part, was not written by Jung into the Red Book, but the first 2 parts, most of the 2nd part was, not quite all of it. And when I first read it through, I started reading it in English, and then I turned to the German version, which I found much easier to read for me, and more somehow palatable. I was not very taken with it. I didn't like it very much. It's very strong. There are sections in it that are hard to read, hard to understand, kind of confused. It's not like the Jung you know from the collected works, the rational Jung, the psychologically minded Jung, the scientist Jung. This is a different Jung. It's a Jung who's a poet, who's an artist, who's confused and finding his way, who doesn't know quite what he's doing, and he's showing you all this in this text. And so there are sections of it that are very hard to digest, in a sense. But with time and studying it more, got used to that, and I found a lot of interest, and the more I read it, the more I like it. Okay, so the first take was kind of resistant, and then gradually I began to like it more and to understand what was really going on in there and how deep and how serious it was. At one point, a group of us here in Zurich at ISAP created a performance of the Red Book, and we took 7 scenes from the Red Book and put them on stage. And that was a very important experience for me to get deeper into the Red Book and to see how alive it is. So we did, for instance, the scene where Jung calls out, "My soul, where are you?" And he's in the desert, and then he hears a voice, a woman's voice in the distance, saying, at first she says, "Wait, wait." That's the first voice he hears. And then slowly she takes a form, and he starts talking to her, and there's a dialogue. So that was the first scene we did. And then he comes upon this scene with Elijah and Salome and the snake, and he has a dialogue with them, and we go into that, and there's a moment there where he's actually transformed into a Christ figure. So it's very dramatic, and we did 7 of these dramatic scenes, and from that I got a real strong experience of how alive this text is, if you let yourself really go into it and imagine it along with Jung. But you have to read it slowly. And nowadays, groups of people have formed, they tell me all the time in different parts of the world, where there's one in Los Angeles, there's one in London, there's one here in Zurich, and other places, where a small group of people, maybe 5 or 6, maybe they're analysts or students or just interested people, will meet regularly and read a portion of the Red Book together and talk about it. And I think that's a good way to read it, to actually discuss it, to reflect on it with other people, and it makes it more relevant and easier to digest in a sense that way. Now, the latest project I've been involved in is to ask a number of people, actually there are 50 Jungian scholars and analysts from around the world, to write an essay about the Red Book for our time. So the question is it relevant for our time? What can we make of it? How can we use it? And so I'm getting 50 answers. And this will be published in 3 volumes. My colleague, Thomas Arzt, is my co-editor, and he and I are working on this together. The first volume will be published this fall, second next year in the winter, and the third by next summer, we hope. So we're just finishing up the first volume now. And in each of these, and these are authors from all over the world, so from China, from Japan, from South America, Africa, Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia. What is the Red Book, meaning of the Red Book for our time in your culture? And for you as a Chinese, for instance. So the Chinese colleague wrote an essay asking the question, why is the Red Book red? Because in China the color red is so important, so he reflects on the color red and thinks that adds a great significance to the meaning of the work for the Chinese, that it's Red Book. But I could say much more about this, and I will maybe in a moment, but I think what people are finding is that in these turbulent times, in these difficult times, it can be a resource to study and maybe to get some hints about how to find one's own way in difficult times, in transitional times. And that's what we're working on.
Just the last question, Murray. Does Jungian psychology have a future, or will it die out of the present generation, pass it into history? What's your best guess?
This is a question that's asked by many, many people and by Jungian analysts. When I lived in Chicago, I heard on the radio one day that a women's club that had been operating for 100 years in Chicago was now closing because all of the members had gotten old. Most of them had died off. There weren't enough new ones coming in anymore. And so there was a ceremony for turning off the lights. And I thought, who's going to turn off the lights for Jungian psychology? Are we going to have to turn off the lights in my generation, the next one, the next one? Because everything passes. Nothing is forever. Even religions disappear. They might live a couple thousand years, but eventually they pass away. Greek religion is gone, and Egyptian religion is gone, and so on. So everything passes, but and among Jungians, there's a lot of I would say anxiety, or at least concern that we are an aging population. Junghian Analysts. So I was in a meeting of the Swiss Society a couple of years ago, and they showed the demographics of the members. And you can see, there's a graph like this, it peaks. And the highest point when you look at the age were people who were born in 1943. 1943 is a peak year for Jungian Analysts for some reason. I was born in 1943. Luigi Zoya was born in 1943. Raina Cost was born in 1943. Paul Brucci, John Hill, many of my friends born in 1943 for some reason. That was a bumper year for Jungian Analysts. And from then there's been a decline. So as we age, there are fewer new people coming in, and the old ones are retiring, dying, so on and so forth. So the question was, how much longer can this go on? Now, in the midst of all this discussion, I had a dream, okay, because I was getting anxious myself, I guess, so I had a dream. And in the dream, one of the few times that Jung has ever appeared in my dreams, maybe twice, 3 times, Jung appeared. And he said to me, there's a lot of worry and anxiety about analytical psychology. Don't worry about it. It has a great future. That was my dream. So I told that to a few friends, and that's given me comfort ever since. So I leave it to the unconscious. I leave it to Jung and to history, what will happen in the future. But my best guess is that it will not die out. It might change its form in some ways, but that it will actually increase in importance. And the reason I believe that is that, I had a professor at the University of Chicago who wrote a book about psychoanalysis. Peter Homans was his name, and he describes the origins of psychoanalysis as entering into Western culture at the time when the religious traditions are declining. And also the sociology of the population is changing, so that you have people moving from the countryside into the cities, where they do not have strong family connections anymore, and anonymity starts taking hold. People feel out of contact with other people. They feel like they've lost their cultural roots. And as this happens, and the religious traditions decline in importance, psychoanalysis becomes more important. Because what psychoanalysis offers, as Jung said, is kinship libido. That's one of his great contributions about the transference, that in the transference experience, you experience a deep human connection to another soul. And this brings about a kind of replacement for the loss of kinship with your kinship groups. People live in villages for generations, they know each other, they intermarry and so on. And that's happening more and more in the world today. So the need for what psychoanalysis and Jungian, particularly Jungian psychoanalysis, has to offer is increasing. The need is increasing. Now, whether Jungians can figure out a way to meet that need and deliver that, that's the challenge. The need is there. We have the resources to speak to the need, but can we find a way to speak to these new generations? And I think that's where some adjustments and changes will take place. Maybe the form won't be quite the same as it was, analysis 2 or 3 times a week with an analyst in his office. One of the changes that's already taken place is that a lot of analysts, myself included, are using Skype, media to have dialogues and analytic conversations with people in faraway places in the world. I know analysts who are working with students and analysts and supervisees in China, and they're sitting in San Francisco or in Zurich. The form is changing. Also, it's very important to enter into the academic world. Jungians have tended to stay outside the academic world. They're all academically trained, but very few have really participated strongly in the academic world as professors and so on. And that's changing. A lot more interest on the part of the academy in Jungian psychology. Now, it may not be Jungian psychoanalysis, clinical work. It might be Jungian ideas applied to literature, to art, to film, to religion, to history, cultural studies, anthropology, all those kinds of things. So Jungian ideas have a very strong value in the world. And eventually, I think individuals who are exposed to Jungian ideas will want to go further with it. They'll want to say, yes, that's for me, but I need it in a more personal way, not just out of books, not just academic. And then they will look for Jungian analysts. So I'm quite confident that Jungian psychoanalysis has a good future, but one has to be flexible and adjust. And it's spreading all over the world. I mean, Jungian psychoanalysis is now fully globalized. You know, there are analysts and training programs in Asia, Japan, Korea, China, Singapore, Philippines. There's a group of interested Jungian students. Russia has a Jungian society now, about 50 analysts in Russia that have been trained in the last 20 years. Eastern Europe. So places that were not accessible during the Cold War suddenly opened up in the 90s, and Jungians have been very active in teaching and training in those parts of the world. South America has many societies. Where we have not had any real points of contact or development are in the Middle East, in Muslim countries, because I think the Muslim religion is still very strong. And as long as religion is strong in an area, there's not so much interest in depth psychology. It's when religion has weakened, secularization enters, people lose their sense of meaning, their connection to God, to the spiritual, that they start searching for another way. As long as they have it, and it's enforced, of course, by the governments in those countries, psychology hasn't of much interest. Also in India, it hasn't been very active in India, and I asked a friend of mine, an Indian analyst in Chicago named Arvind Vasavada, who trained with Jung, actually, had sessions with Jung, and he went back to India after his training and he tried to open a practice there. Was totally unsuccessful, so he moved to Chicago, where he had a very good practice in Chicago. So I said, why doesn't it work in India? He said, oh, they have too many gurus there. They have their gurus, they don't need analysts. So as long as you have gurus around who transmit the spiritual tradition, the need isn't so great. But when that disappears and weakens, and it is weakening in India now, people live in high rises, they don't go to temples anymore, they don't, the religious, traditional religious organizations are under a great deal of pressure and threat. The convents, the big monasteries are closing everywhere in the world. They've now been turned into hotels or into retreat centers or spas or something. And they're turning out the lights in the convents. I have a number of acquaintances and colleagues who were nuns, religious orders, and those orders are all dying out. The young women aren't coming into them. And so as the religions fade away, globalization takes hold, everything becomes monetized, everything becomes rationalized, people lose the sense of meaning and the feeling of depth that religions have traditionally provided. And so how do you cope with that? Create a red book. Make your own red book. And that's what people are doing. People who work in analysis typically do active imagination, They work with their dreams. They keep dream notebooks. Some of them paint. Some of them do something like what, maybe not to the degree that Jung did it, and to the state of art that Jung did in his Red Book. The Red Book was featured at the Biennale in Vienna last year, I think. At the entrance to the Biennale, the one before this one, 2 years ago, the Red Book appeared. What's the Red Book doing in an art exhibition? Well, it was featured as a work of art, because it is a work of art. Now, Jung put a tremendous amount of effort into that because it was so meaningful to him, these images and these figures that came to him. I've had patients who do something similar to that, and they're grounded in this. They live out of this. This is their most basic sense of grounding and meaning in their lives. And out of this, they can work in their businesses and their jobs and in their families, and it stabilizes them the way religions have traditionally stabilized people. So it has a great value, and I think it has a great future. Okay.
Really many thanks, Murray, for what you said. Very interesting thinking. Many thanks from all of us of Temenos Association. We also believe in a positive future for the psychology analysis. You have to know that one of our main objectives is to spread out Jungian psychology, talking also with philosophy, with art, with all the cultural expression. So many thanks.